The escalation of the US-China trade war under President Donald Trump's administration marked a turning point for Canada's external economic strategy. Faced with growing protectionism and unexpected tariff shocks from its historically closest ally, Canada began pivoting away from its over-reliance on US markets. By 2018, sweeping US tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel as part of Trump's America First policy sent shockwaves through Ottawa's trade calculus. In response, Canada actively sought to deepen its commercial ties with alternative partners such as the European Union, Japan, and even China. This shift was not only economic, but strategic, part of a broader plan to insulate Canada from US trade volatility. This diversification aligns with Canada's participation in multilateral agreements, like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, and the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA. By leveraging these frameworks, Canada aims to secure stable market access while reducing its economic vulnerability to future US policy swings. From a geopolitical perspective, this move signals a recalibration in North American economic relations. Canada's intention to recalibrate its trade dependency poses long-term implications for North American supply chains, particularly in energy and raw materials. Analysts suggest that this could diminish Washington's leverage in future negotiations while strengthening Canada's role in global trade blocs. The Trump administration's aggressive protectionist agenda disrupted decades of relatively stable trade relations between the United States and Canada. Once pillars of North American economic integration, the two nations found themselves in a cycle of tariffs and retaliation by 2018. Under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, the U.S. imposed steep tariffs, 25% on steel and 10% on aluminum, on Canadian exports, citing national security concerns. This rationale was widely viewed by Canadian officials and economists as both unfounded and politically provocative, triggering an immediate and forceful response from Ottawa. Canada responded with dollar-for-dollar retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, including whiskey, orange juice, and even ketchup, targeting key political constituencies within the U.S. This marked a profound rupture in what had been one of the world's most closely integrated trade relationships. Beyond the immediate economic cost, the rift symbolized a collapse in mutual trust. The era of NAFTA-driven liberalization, which had underpinned North American commerce for nearly 25 years, gave way to an atmosphere of unpredictability and suspicion. The ensuing renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA was not just a rebranding, but a recognition that the old consensus had fractured. For Canada, the episode reinforced the imperative to never again be economically cornered by a single trading partner, even one with shared borders and values. Mounting public frustration in Canada over the Trump-era trade disruptions played a pivotal role in reshaping the country's political landscape. Mark Carney, a former central banker with global credibility, successfully tapped into a growing sentiment of economic nationalism, not against Canada's own interests, but against its disproportionate dependency on an increasingly unpredictable United States. Carney's campaign positioned the Trump administration's tariffs and erratic trade posture as wake-up calls. By drawing a clear line between Canada's economic sovereignty and US volatility, he framed diversification not as a luxury, but as a national imperative. His electoral platform emphasized expanding multilateral trade agreements, reducing export overexposure to US markets, and cultivating high-trust commercial ties with the EU, Japan, and emerging economies. These policies resonated with voters still reeling from the economic uncertainty triggered by the US-Canada trade rift. Carney's victory marked more than a political shift. It signaled a recalibration of Canada's external economic identity. It reaffirmed a broader movement across the global West. Democratic allies rethinking their strategic trade alignments in a world no longer defined by post-Cold War unipolarity. In response to rising geopolitical uncertainty and trade tensions with the United States, Canada is undergoing a fundamental restructuring of its energy export strategy. Historically, over 95% of Canada's oil, natural gas, and mineral exports have flowed southward to the US, a dependency now viewed as both economically risky and strategically limiting. The new national objective is bold: reduce energy export reliance on the US from 95% to just 60% within the next decade. To achieve this, Canada is aggressively developing alternative trade routes and infrastructure aimed at reaching high-demand markets in Europe and Asia, regions that are increasingly prioritizing energy diversification and supply security post-Ukraine. This strategy is not limited to oil and gas. Canada, rich in critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, is positioning itself as a trusted supplier of clean energy inputs to support the global shift toward electrification and energy transition. In particular, EU nations are eager to replace Russian supplies with Canadian alternatives, given Canada's political stability and environmental standards. The shift also aligns with Canada's broader vision of becoming a global clean tech leader. But the pivot will demand massive investment in export infrastructure, ports, liquefaction terminals, and interprovincial logistics to redirect energy flows efficiently and at scale. The geopolitical shockwaves from Russia's invasion of Ukraine have forced the European Union into an urgent energy realignment. As Brussels scrambles to end its dependency on Russian hydrocarbons, Canada has emerged as a highly attractive alternative, offering not just reliable energy, but energy perceived as cleaner, safer, and geopolitically neutral. Unlike the United States, whose energy policies are often entangled in domestic political volatility and export restrictions, Canada projects a stable, rules-based framework. Its global image, rooted in environmental responsibility and diplomatic neutrality, has positioned it as a green partner of choice for the EU, particularly in light of the bloc's ambitious climate commitments under the Green Deal. Canadian officials have capitalized on this perception. The messaging from Ottawa frames Canadian energy, especially LNG and critical minerals, not only as low emission, but also ethically sourced and aligned with Western democratic values. This narrative plays well in a European political context wary of authoritarian energy leverage, as seen in the case of Russia. While logistical and infrastructure gaps remain, Canadian energy diplomacy has gained serious traction in Berlin, Paris, and Brussels. Multiple memoranda of understanding have been signed to explore joint ventures in hydrogen, LNG, and mineral supply chains. Canada is increasingly framed not merely as a backup, but as a long-term pillar in Europe's new energy architecture. Despite its strategic ambitions to diversify energy exports away from the United States, Canada faces a sobering logistical reality. Its current infrastructure overwhelmingly favors southbound flows. Nearly all of its pipelines, ports, and processing facilities are configured to serve the US market, making a rapid shift toward Europe and Asia economically and physically constrained. Energy analysts estimate that Canada will require 5 to 10 years of sustained investment to realign its infrastructure. This includes constructing new LNG terminals on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, expanding deep-water ports, and building cross-provincial pipelines that can bypass the entrenched US-oriented network. The LNG Canada project in British Columbia and the proposed Énergie Saguenay terminal in Quebec are among the flagship initiatives aiming to unlock eastward and westward export routes. However, these projects face complex regulatory, environmental, and political hurdles, slowing timelines and deterring private capital in some cases. As Europe and Asia scramble to secure long-term, stable energy suppliers, Canada risks missing its window of opportunity if these bottlenecks persist. Without accelerated infrastructure development, Ottawa's vision of trade diversification may remain aspirational rather than actionable. Mark Carney's administration has unveiled a strategic economic realignment that aims to future-proof Canada's global trade positioning. At the heart of his agenda lies a multidimensional pivot: scaling energy exports, expanding multilateral trade, cushioning vulnerable sectors, and accelerating the development of critical minerals vital to next-generation industries. The cornerstone of this strategy is a triad of sectors: energy, both conventional and green, electric vehicles, EVs, and strategic minerals such as lithium, nickel, and cobalt. These are not arbitrary choices. They align tightly with global megatrends, including decarbonization, supply chain security, and geopolitical reshoring of manufacturing. Carney's policies emphasize upstream investment in mining, midstream processing capacity, and downstream integration into high-value sectors like EV batteries and renewable energy technologies. In tandem, Canada is leveraging trade agreements like CETA and CPTPP to open secure export pathways, while also implementing domestic support programs for sectors harmed by trade realignment, particularly manufacturing and agriculture. Crucially, Carney's blueprint reflects a broader vision, shifting Canada from a commodity-dependent exporter into a vertically integrated player in the global clean economy. If executed effectively, this could establish Canada as a transatlantic and trans-Pacific hub for sustainable growth, economically competitive, strategically independent. Amid rising trade frictions between the United States and its key allies, Canada is capitalizing on its global image as a cooperative, rules-based, and non-confrontational trading partner. This positioning has proven increasingly attractive to economic heavyweights such as the European Union and Japan, both of which are actively recalibrating their trade dependencies away from Washington. Unlike the US, which has deployed tariffs, export controls, and industrial subsidies in ways that have sparked backlash even among allies, Canada presents itself as a country that honors multilateralism and avoids weaponizing trade policy. This soft power advantage is now translating into hard economic opportunity. Recent initiatives include expanded energy talks with Germany, critical minerals supply agreements with Japan, and joint ventures in hydrogen technology and battery manufacturing. Canada is no longer just an extension of the North American trade zone. It is emerging as an independent strategic partner for economies seeking predictability and values-aligned cooperation. This realignment also serves as a hedge. As geopolitical uncertainty and economic nationalism accelerate in Washington, nations like Japan and EU members are deepening links with Canada, not only for resource access, but for political reassurance. Ottawa's diplomatic reliability has become an asset as valuable as its natural reserves. The United States is increasingly alarmed by Canada's shift toward diversified energy exports. For decades, Washington enjoyed a near monopoly on Canadian oil, gas, and critical minerals, resources that not only powered its economy, but also underpinned its geopolitical influence across the Western Hemisphere. That grip is now weakening. If Canada continues to redirect its energy flows toward Europe and Asia, the US risks losing access to one of the most secure, affordable, and politically aligned sources of supply. This would deal a blow to US energy security, especially as domestic shale production faces cost, environmental, and regulatory constraints. Geopolitically, the implications are even broader. American leverage over allies, often exercised through energy coordination and resource access, would be diluted. As Canada signs bilateral mineral deals with Japan and energy MOUs with Germany, Washington's centrality in transatlantic and Indo-Pacific supply chains could be significantly diminished. Washington's concern is not hypothetical. US officials and energy executives have already raised alarms over the prospect of losing Canada as a default energy partner. In a world increasingly defined by resource nationalism and fragmented supply chains, that loss could reverberate far beyond oil prices, touching manufacturing, defense, and foreign policy calculus. The North American auto industry, once a model of cross-border integration, is now a casualty of escalating trade tensions. As tariff barriers and political friction intensified under the Trump administration, the once fluid supply chains between Canada and the US began to strain and fragment. Critical components such as engines, transmissions, and battery modules, previously moving seamlessly across the border multiple times during production, have faced rising costs, logistical bottlenecks, and regulatory uncertainty. Several automakers and Tier 1 suppliers are now exploring relocation or expansion options in Mexico, where favorable trade terms and lower labor costs offer more predictability. Asia, too, has re-emerged as a viable alternative. Countries like Vietnam and Thailand are attracting attention as part of the China Plus One strategy, providing diversified sourcing for components at competitive prices. For Canada, this shift threatens industrial jobs and investment in key provinces like Ontario and Quebec. The broader concern is strategic. As EVs reshape the global automotive landscape, Canada's marginalization in the evolving supply chain could have long-term consequences. Without robust policy intervention and investment, Canada risks becoming a secondary player in the very sector it helped build over decades. The European Union's aggressive transition toward electric mobility, anchored by its 2035 ban on new internal combustion engine vehicles, has radically intensified the bloc's search for reliable sources of critical minerals. In this strategic pivot, Canada has emerged as a linchpin supplier. With vast reserves of lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite, Canada offers both geological abundance and geopolitical stability, two attributes the EU now deems non-negotiable amid escalating concerns over China's dominance in battery supply chains. Brussels is actively working to de-risk its clean tech ambitions, and Ottawa has seized the opening. Joint ventures and long-term offtake agreements are already taking shape. European automakers and battery manufacturers are investing in Canadian extraction and processing facilities to lock in future supply and comply with the EU's proposed Critical Raw Materials Act, which emphasises sourcing from trusted jurisdictions. For Canada, this is more than a commodity export opportunity. It is a seat at the table in defining the future of clean mobility. As Europe accelerates its green transition, Canada's role as a secure, Western-aligned mineral partner is not only valuable, it is indispensable. Despite recent diplomatic frictions, including the arrest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou and subsequent detentions of Canadian nationals, Canada has not fully severed its economic engagement with China. In fact, selective cooperation continues, particularly in sectors where mutual interests intersect, energy and strategic minerals. For Beijing, Canada is increasingly viewed as a pragmatic alternative to the United States in key resource domains. Chinese state-owned and private enterprises have sought partnerships or equity stakes in Canadian mining and energy projects, especially those involving lithium, rare earth elements, and natural gas, critical to China's decarbonization agenda and EV ambitions. Ottawa has responded with nuanced policy tools, tightening foreign investment reviews in critical sectors while avoiding outright decoupling. The aim is clear: safeguard national security without alienating a market that remains central to global commodity demand. This calibrated engagement reflects Canada's evolving trade doctrine. neither fully Atlanticist nor openly Sino-centric, but increasingly multipolar. As US-China rivalry intensifies, Canada is positioning itself as a controlled access supplier, open for business, but on its own terms. While Ottawa accelerates efforts to diversify energy exports away from the US, internal opposition is mounting, led most vocally by the province of Alberta. Home to the lion's share of Canada's oil and gas production, Alberta views the federal strategy as economically risky and logistically unrealistic in the near term. Alberta officials have issued stark warnings. Slashing energy exports to the US could trigger significant revenue losses, threaten jobs, and undermine investor confidence. They argue that the American market remains the only fully developed high-volume outlet for Alberta's fossil fuels, backed by decades of built infrastructure and commercial contracts. Moreover, provincial leaders caution that shifting export flows to Europe or Asia, though strategically sound, requires more than political will. It demands multi-billion-dollar investments in ports, pipelines, and LNG terminals, none of which can be deployed overnight. The clash underscores a deeper national tension between Canada's climate-aligned, geopolitically diversified trade vision and the economic realities of resource-dependent provinces. Alberta is not rejecting diversification per se, but it is demanding a phased, economically responsible transition. As Canada ramps up its energy and mineral export diversification strategy, it is encountering resistance not from foreign governments, but from within. Indigenous communities and environmental groups have raised significant concerns over the pace, scale, and governance of proposed infrastructure projects aimed at rerouting trade flows away from the US. Many of these projects, pipelines, LNG terminals, and mining developments, cut across Indigenous territories or ecologically sensitive areas. While some First Nations support resource partnerships as pathways to economic self-determination, others have denounced inadequate consultation, land encroachment, and environmental degradation. The Canadian government faces a high-stakes balancing act, accelerate strategic infrastructure to meet geopolitical and trade objectives, while upholding treaty rights and environmental stewardship. Missteps could spark legal challenges, delay timelines, and damage Canada's global image as a responsible resource exporter. To mitigate backlash, Ottawa has pledged to implement stricter environmental reviews and engage in early, transparent consultation with Indigenous leaders. However, trust remains fragile and timelines remain uncertain. The success of Canada's diversification agenda may ultimately hinge as much on social license as on geopolitics. The long-standing asymmetry in the Canada-US economic relationship, defined by Canada's heavy dependence on a single trading partner, is giving way to a more diversified, dynamic, and geopolitically aware framework. While full decoupling remains implausible due to deep infrastructure and supply chain ties, the era of one-directional trade reliance is drawing to a close. This evolution is not the product of a single administration, but a broader convergence of forces: protectionism in Washington, global supply chain realignment, climate policy imperatives, and the rise of resource nationalism. Canada's response, rooted in strategic diversification, infrastructure investment, and geopolitical hedging, signals a new chapter in North American commerce. The emerging framework is complex. Canada will continue to trade with the US, but as a more autonomous actor, embedded in overlapping trade networks that also include Europe and the Indo-Pacific. This multipolar architecture dilutes Washington's unilateral leverage, while elevating Canada's geopolitical utility as a bridge economy between Western markets. Critically, this shift demands institutional maturity, policies that balance domestic competitiveness with foreign policy alignment, and infrastructure capable of supporting multidirectional trade flows. The post-NAFTA North American trade order will be less predictable, but more resilient, diversified, and strategically balanced.